Let's see. Hopefully, everybody can see the screen. Everybody see that okay?
Great. Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, I will get started then. Um, Thank you for inviting me, asking me to speak. What I'm going to be talking about today, of course, is the modern streetcar. But when this latest effort on the streetcar really got started through the chamber. Okay. So this latest effort on the streetcar really began with a kind of joint effort between the city and with the Chamber of Commerce and their Urban Core Strategic Planning Committee. And so the committee met for about 3 years. At the end of that time, they produced a strategic plan for the urban core. And so this quote comes from that strategic plan. And that is that cities never stand still. They are either growing and moving forward, or they are declining and falling behind. One second here. Hopefully you're not hearing our dog barking in the background. If you are, I apologize for that. So what we're now doing is we're on our way. The city has already approved taken all the steps necessary for the streetcar to move forward. And we are really on our way to creating a really special, vibrant, and accessible urban core. And the modern streetcar is critical to building that dynamic city for our next generation. But we do have some problems. One of those problems for the city is that we're running out of room, particularly in our suburban areas. And so by the time Omaha reaches its 200th birthday, sometime after 2050, we will start to run out of room to grow at the suburban fringe of the city. And that's really going to change the dynamics for the city of Omaha. We've never had that problem. Unlike most cities across the country, we have always had the ability to annex at our edge, annex other cities up to 10,000 in population. And so when we reach that edge of development, we'll start to face a problem that many other cities across the country have, and that is that we will have this sort of fixed and oftentimes in other cities' cases, declining tax base, while at the same time having aging infrastructure and therefore increased costs associated with that older infrastructure. And so it's really a problem that we have not had to face in the past, and that is something we're going to have to deal with going forward. A second problem that we've had is that in our urban core, between 1963 and around 2014, when we looked at this, downtown Omaha had lost about 21,000 jobs, but we had added about 12,000 parking stalls during that time as we began to try and compete with suburban development that was happening nationwide and happening here in Omaha. And so we started to really kind of trade jobs for parking in our suburban, again, trying to compete with our suburban development. And so this kind of issue of being able to attract and retain jobs by providing parking became an issue for us, as it did for many cities across the country. And so to put that kind of in perspective, this is an image of what the off-street parking looked like in 1963. And those kind of bluish green rectangles that you see are basically the off-street parking areas in 1963. But when we looked at it again in 2014, this is all of the additional parking that had been added since 1963. And we were reaching a point where when you take out the right of way for streets and the interstate and so forth, we began to reach a point where almost 50% of the land in the urban core is dedicated to parking. And at any given point in time, about half of that parking sits vacant. So the parking that is busy and used during the day, during the week at offices across the urban core, are mostly empty at night and on the weekend, and then the reverse is true. Parking in the old market or the Arena Convention Center that's empty during the day, during the week, fills up at night and on the weekends. And so we're building a lot of parking in downtown really at the same ratios that you would have in a suburban setting, even though it's an urban core. So when we looked at moving forward, the problem that we faced is that market studies that we've done since 2009, when we developed a downtown master plan, and since that time, about a half a dozen market studies have all told us about the same thing, and that is that we should be able to attract about 30,000 jobs and 30,000 residents over a 30-year period. The problem that we face is that if we continue to park our urban core the way we have over the last 40, 50 years, we're going to need to develop about 50,000 additional structured parking stalls. Well, the cost of a structured parking stall today is running anywhere from $25,000 to $30,000 and more. And so if you just work from that 30,000 number, we're looking at $1.5 billion needed to build those 50,000 parking stalls. At the same time, presently, we're able to operate our parking system and subsidize those off-street parking stalls because of the efficiencies and sharing that we're able to do with parking. The problem is, as we go forward, there's a limited amount of that sharing that can occur. And at some point, we will then go back to where we were a number of years ago, and that is needing to subsidize those 50,000 parking stalls with public tax dollars. At the same time, 50,000 parking stalls would consume about 40 square blocks of our urban core with nothing but 6-story tall parking garages that then consume all of that land and don't produce anything in tax revenue. We would average about $50 million in development on each of those 40 square blocks. So we then lose the ability to capture about $2 billion in new development. So as you can see, parking is really a problem for Omaha taxpayers in that it will cost taxpayers money. At the same time, it will choke development in our urban core. Now, maybe other cities across the country have a similar situation, and maybe they're doing what we're doing. And so we've looked at cities across the country and really studied what has worked and what has not worked elsewhere. This is downtown Denver in 1976, an aerial. You see a lot of surface parking in downtown Denver. So they did what we've done, and that is build a lot of parking back in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. But Denver and a handful of other cities across the country took a little different approach in the last couple of decades. And what they've done is they've decided to focus more on transit and less on parking. And so what you see in that same area today, where you had downtown parking lots, today you see a lot of multi-story mixed-use buildings, office, residential, and so forth. What's interesting about Denver also is that they have about as many parking stalls in their downtown core as we do in downtown Omaha, but they have about 4.5 times as many jobs in that same area as we do. And so they obviously have approached access to those jobs and access in and out of their urban core and moving around their urban core differently than we have here in Omaha. So there's a lot we can learn from Denver. So what happens across the country is that as cities become more dense, they begin to move into more permanent forms of transit. They move to rail transit. And so what we're seeing across the country is that streetcars lessen the need for parking, and that we think that will happen for us as well. And that is because of the permanency of the streetcar. It allows people to move around without a car, and it allows us to share some of those existing vacant parking stalls. It also reduces the number of stalls we need for new project, and therefore it frees up all of those blocks that I mentioned earlier for new development. and really creates enough additional revenue that we should be able to help fund a more affordable housing in our urban core. As I said, we've looked at cities around the country. We've done over 20 different site visits over the last 20 years. There are also 46 cities in the country that either have already developed streetcars or are studying them or are, like Omaha, in the process of putting a streetcar in place. We've looked at three of those 46 cities in particular: Milwaukee, Portland, Kansas City. They have all seen major increases in the value of property within their urban core and in the amount of development that is occurring in their urban core. And again, what we've seen in these cities across the country is this sort of symbiotic relationship between the construction and development of permanent transit, like the streetcar, like Orbit, with those expensive stops that Orbit has, that has allowed those urban core areas to develop in a more dense way and to see the value of property in the urban core increase. So streetcars help us drive growth that connects people with major districts and destinations and activity centers across the downtown and midtown areas. It allows us to revitalize the urban core by encouraging economic development and optimizing the tax base. It provides a simple, localized, high-frequency transit service. A streetcar will get to a stop every 10 minutes. It provides opportunities for a variety of new housing because it connects such a large area. We have a variety of housing opportunities that can be developed. And it also helps us to attract and retain young talent. Now, to that point, we spoke at the YP Summit, the mayor and I did recently. We had a packed house. We also had a lot of people stop at the booth that the Streetcar Authority had, and we had a lot of interest. So it is something that is of interest to young professionals in our area. And I have kind of a personal story as well. I just recently had dinner with my granddaughter who moved downtown a few months back. She's very excited about everything that's happening in the urban core, obviously very excited about the streetcar. She knows all about it from her grandfather, but she'll be graduating this spring from UNO, and she's starting to look for work around the country. And she said, I hope I can find something in Omaha because I really want to stay here and really enjoy this urban core area that I've come to love since I moved downtown. So I'm very hopeful that she finds something here locally as well. But she sees the streetcar as something that is attractive and interesting to her. So for people to kind of get a visual idea of what the streetcar can mean for us here in Omaha, this is a rendering out of that urban core strategic plan of Farnham Street looking west, just west of 20th Street. On the far left of the image, the brown stone building that you see there is the Rose Theater. If you're familiar with this stretch of Farnham, there are a lot of parking lots in this area and not very active parking lots at that. We recently toured this area with the owner of those parking lots. He has developed thousands of apartments in the urban core in Omaha and also has done things elsewhere. What he told us was, he said, I own these lots, but I have held on to them, waiting to find out if Omaha is going to build a streetcar. Because if Omaha decided not to build a streetcar, I would build some 3- and 4-story stick-built buildings. I'd build more parking because I would need it. But if the city was going to build a streetcar, I'm looking to build 8 to 10-story buildings in this area because I won't need to build as much parking and I'll have more demand for my units. So what he's describing is something that looks a lot like what you see in the image here. And so what's really important to understand, and that I think is not necessarily clear to everyone, is that the streetcar is really an infrastructure investment, much like a street that generates economic development. And the way we are doing this is not unlike what we have done elsewhere in Omaha as a city, but also at what you see in the suburban fringe of Omaha. So Exarban Village is an example of how the city has used funding for the construction of initial infrastructure to generate economic development. So when Exarban Village was first coming together, there was a need to really kick off the development. So the city paid to install the initial streets and sewers and utilities and so forth that were needed for the first phases of Exarban Village. And then as development began to occur and the tax increment increased taxes that were paid for that new development, a portion of those increased taxes came back to the city of Omaha to reimburse the city for that upfront investment. As time went on, additional infrastructure was built using tax increment financing, and the tax increment from the new development that was enabled by that infrastructure investment came back to pay for the streets and sewers and other infrastructure needed for Exarban Village. SIDs on the suburban fringe, sanitary and improvement districts, are financed much the same way. In that case, developers, as opposed to the city, would issue tax-free municipal bonds that are used to pay for the infrastructure in a suburban subdivision. As development occurs in that subdivision and taxes are paid, a portion of those taxes come back to pay for those municipal bonds. So again, this is not unlike what the city has done in many cases around the city, and those kinds of projects don't require a public vote.
Bust to move.
Is there a question? Okay, well, we'll get to questions at the end. So bottom line is, how do you pay for a streetcar? Well, you build a streetcar because the streetcar increases economic development, increases property values, increases tax revenue, and that revenue then comes back to help pay for the streetcar. So how does that work? Well, for folks who may not be familiar with tax increment financing, let's take as an example one of those parking lots that I talked about earlier. Right now, it pays very little in taxes. Over time, the value of that parking lot will go up, but it goes up very slowly over a period of time. And so the tax revenue that comes to the city, the county, the school district, and other taxing jurisdictions is not very high from that parking lot. But if someone builds a new project on that parking lot, there is an increase in the value of that property because that new project, let's say it's a $20 million building, increases the value of that property. And so the developer of that project will pay new taxes, additional taxes for that new $20 million project. Now, the taxing entities will continue to get the same tax revenue that they had before that development took place. But at the end of the 15 years, when the tax increment runs out, then those taxing entities will now get that significantly higher increased tax base caused by that project that was built on the parking lot, on the former parking lot. What happens with the streetcar, and this is verified by studies across the country, including federal studies, is that the streetcar increases the value of the projects that occur in the urban core. It also increases the value of existing property in the urban core. And so the revenue that we would use to build the streetcar is coming from that increased tax revenue that is created by the streetcar. And at the end of that 15-year period, then that increased tax revenue would flow to the city, the school district, county, and so forth. So it's really that increased tax revenue that's generated by the streetcar that is being used to pay for the streetcar. So what's important for everyone to understand is that the way we are paying for the streetcar is taking that increased tax revenue and using it to pay for the streetcar, but we are only using the taxes paid by new or redeveloped income producing commercial and multifamily properties within the corridor of the streetcar. We are not taking any revenue from single family homes, condominiums, or residential buildings with 4 or fewer units. The streetcar project will cost about $306 million at current estimate, and we are anticipating a minimum of $3.2 billion in new development over the next 15 years. Now, it's important to know that we've tried to be very conservative in our projections over the next 15 years, and that $3.2 billion is actually less than what we have seen developed over the last 15 years. So we're being very conservative. We are confident that we will have far more than 3.2 billion over the next 15 years. But again, we wanted to be conservative in our projections. We also, just to put things in perspective, what is so important about Mutual of Omaha's project and their new headquarters is that when you take the 600 million from their new headquarters and you take what will likely be around 400 million in new development on their existing campus, by themselves, Mutual of Omaha is really bringing about $1 billion of that 3.2 billion to the table right off the bat. What's also important to understand is that although we were very conservative in our initial estimates using that 3.2 billion, just to be sure that we were not over projecting and that we would have adequate revenue, the city hired MuniCap, which is a company that reviews projects like this for investors and really is the kind of gold standard for someone who is looking to purchase the kinds of bonds that the city is going to put out to finance this project. MuniCap spent about 9 months looking at all of the potential development in the corridor. They took all the information that we gave them for the development that was anticipated, the market studies that we talked about. They took the plans from that were developed through that urban core strategic planning effort and the revenue that it was likely to come from that. They actually went parcel by parcel and looked at all of the parcels within the 6 to 7 block corridor surrounding the streetcar, where the revenue, which is the area that we are looking at to capture the revenue to fund the streetcar. And at the end of that 9 months, they came back and said that they were confident that at a minimum, that the city would see about $608 million in revenue, tax increment revenue, from that corridor, that 6 to 7 block corridor, that could be applied toward the bonds for the streetcar. That $608 million is more than enough to cover the $306 million in bonds that we're projecting are needed to pay for the construction of the streetcar. And again, because their analysis was so conservative, they based that $608 million on about $2 billion in development over a 15-year period, not $3.2 billion or even the amount of development that we've seen over the last 15 years. And so we're confident that beyond that $608 million, we will have at least another $400 million or over $1 billion in TIF revenue over the next 15 years. That additional $400 million can then be used for things like affordable housing, bikeways, and other streetcar extensions in the future. So how do you pay for a streetcar? You really, again, build the streetcar. It's important to understand that it pays for itself. There's no citywide property tax rate increase needed to pay for the streetcar. We're diverting no money from other city projects, so there's no money coming from pothole filling, for example. No money is coming from outside of the property inside that 6 to 7 block streetcar corridor. We're taking no money again from existing and new single family condos, residential buildings with fewer than 4 units. We are only taking revenue from new or redeveloped income producing commercial and multifamily properties within that 6 to 7 block corridor. So the only people who are paying for the streetcar are the people who are actually benefiting from the streetcar. The route you're probably familiar with by now, but just to recap, it really starts on the west at the UNMC campus at 42nd and Farnham, Traveling east on Farnham at Turner Boulevard, it switches over to Harney Street, just as the traffic does today. It runs eastbound on Harney to 10th, north on 10th Street to the front door of the CHI Health Center, back south on 10th to Capitol Avenue, east on Capitol Avenue to 8th Street, 8th Street south to Farnham, and Farnham back to UNMC. Again, about 22 stops. A streetcar comes by about every 10 minutes at one of those stops. The project schedule, we are well into design. We're past 15% design. We're headed toward 30% design. At the Streetcar Authority board meeting today, they approved the contract with Kiewit Construction for pre-construction services. Kiewit will then work with HDR, who is the designer of the project. So we have two local companies, international companies working on this. They will work together when they get to the 30% design to give us an initial cost estimate, to also advise us on ways that we can try and save to make sure that we bring this in as efficiently as possible. We will finalize the design later this year. We are also in the process of the board today, in fact, approved the guidelines for vehicle procurement. So that will be going out probably this fall to companies that would be interested in providing the cars that we will use for the project. We may begin a little bit of utility relocation later this year, but the bulk of the construction will occur in 24 and 25 and early 26. The vehicles take several years to build, so it will not be until early in 26 before we receive the first of the cars. We'll go through a testing process on those cars, and it will take probably 9 months or so to test them. We expect that we would be able to begin service probably in December of 2026. However, we will probably postpone the opening until spring of 2026 so that we're able to test the vehicles through the winter, make sure we know how to operate in a winter condition. So again, possibly open in 2026, probably in very early 2027. So back to that Urban Core strategic plan and keeping it as our guide, it says that to reach our potential, Omaha must reaffirm and reinforce the Urban Core's historic role as the cultural, entertainment, residential, and employment part of the region. And the streetcar really gets us there. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone may have. I'll stop sharing. And if I need to, I may come back and open it back up again so that I can refer to some of the slides. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Steve. We actually did get a couple in the chat.
Okay.
So the first one that we got was from Lynn, and she said, please explain how the benefits of the streetcar are different from Orbit, and why does Omaha need both?
Sure. Well, the first thing to keep in mind about Orbit is that Orbit is really, it is Omaha Rapid Transit. I mean, that's Omaha Rapid Bus Transit is how they got the name Orbit. So the whole idea of rapid transit is being able to cover longer distances more rapidly. And so that the key to that kind of bus rapid transit system or BRT system is that you have fewer stops and the stops are spaced a greater distance apart. So if you look at the Orbit stops, they stop about every half mile. And so they can cover a very long distance in a shorter period of time. And so that's why they start at the West Roads and come downtown, stopping about every half mile. The streetcar is kind of the opposite of bus rapid transit. It is really more of a local transportation system that is meant to stop often. So the streetcar stops are about every 3 to 4 blocks apart. The idea, it will be free to ride. So the idea is that you will be able to just hop on and hop off in the urban core. And so where Orbit is designed to bring people from outside of the urban core into the urban core quickly, and then again get them back out of the urban core quickly, the streetcar is really all about moving around the urban core. And so being able to go from the old market to an event at the CHI Health Center, or to be able to go to dinner in the old market, but go have dessert in Blackstone, or be able to work in the urban core, but meet someone for lunch at Midtown Crossing. So the idea behind the streetcar is really about moving around the urban core and stopping more often. And so the streetcar will move slowly. It'll move at the speed of traffic in the urban core. But again, being able to just have that hop on, hop off service. Sometimes streetcars are referred to as horizontal elevators, because just like you hop on an elevator to go a couple of floors in a building, you do the same thing with the streetcar, being stop, maybe travel a couple of stops and hop off again. So again, they perform complementary functions, but different functions.
And just so everyone knows, I can continue to ask Steve some of the questions that are coming in the chat, but feel free to also, raise your hand or unmute yourself.
Okay.
Cindy?
Yeah, I just want to follow up with that a little bit. So yeah, on the differences between Orbit and the streetcar and freeing up parking spaces. So how then long-term and to generate the money and free up these parking spaces for development, and how does hopping on and hopping off within the CHI Center area and the Old Market and Midtown, how does that then generate parking spaces? If I drive to Midtown and then ride it to CHI, I'm just being devil's advocate and want to understand
Sure.
how we're going to generate money then. Yeah.
Sure. So number of things.
Okay.
So using Mutual as an example, the building they're building would hold 4,000 employees. At the site, they're building 2,200 parking stalls. And so part of what Mutual is recognizing is that, number one, you don't need a parking stall for every employee. However, up until now, what we have seen is companies saying, we're going to bring in 2,000 employees, we need 2,000 parking stalls. Or we're going to have 500 employees, we need 500 parking stalls. And so what Mutual is saying is, well, we understand that not everybody that might at some point come to work in the office will be here at the same time every day. And so we don't need as much parking, number one. Number two, if we do need additional parking, we also recognize that we have a lot of parking already at Midtown Crossing that can be tapped if we use the streetcar to move people back and forth. And there's also a lot of parking in the corridor. So that's step number one. New projects, new people coming in are recognizing they don't need as much parking. We just met with an apartment developer the other day, same thing. Normally, they said we would end up with maybe one stall per bedroom. They said we're probably going to not even have one stall per unit. And so they're building less parking because they recognize there's already parking in the area. We're also working with developers who are looking to bring in bring companies to downtown. They're explaining to them, yes, just like Mutual, you can build parking on site, but you don't need as much because there's parking across the street, there's parking down the block, there's parking along the route of the streetcar. So that's one thing. A second thing is that just like in suburbia, what we have seen historically in downtown is that every business feels they need all the parking that they think they would need, and they need it right outside their front door. And so what's happening in downtown is, even if you are a business, let's say in the past, in the old market, and you're looking at lunch, you're thinking somebody is going to get in their car at their office and drive down to the old market and go to lunch. So I need I need parking down here in the old market. So now what they're recognizing is, no, now people can go out of, leave their office building, hop on the streetcar and go to lunch. And so you don't need that parking in the old market, as much parking in the old market. And so when you then look at that across the whole spectrum, you start to see these existing stalls being used that were not being used before, because now somebody can park further away from where they work, or you can park someplace else and go to the old market. I hear from the businesses in the Blackstone, they're not looking forward to the construction. That's going to be a pain in the neck. But when it's done, they recognize that they don't have a lot of parking. And so they're saying, this is great. People can park and travel longer distance. And then finally, at CHI Health Center or TD Ameritrade, what you see is everybody kind of, especially for a one-of-a-kind event like a concert, what you find is everybody just crushes in at the last minute trying to get to that parking stall right at CHI Health Center. Well, what this will do is we could bring over 1,000 people over the span of about an hour to the CHI Health Center from using the streetcar, so they can park further away. And so now we're removing maybe as many as 800 cars from the traffic right at the CHI Health Center. And so again, we can bring a lot more people to events. We can bring extra cars on. We'll probably operate 6 cars most of the time, but we'll have an extra car. If we needed to, we could bring that on so we could bring even more people to and from. So that's one way. And then by using our existing parking, we'll get revenue from that parking that otherwise we're not getting. So we'll get additional revenue from that parking. So
Yeah.
kind of a long answer, but hopefully that answers your question.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate that answer. Yeah, I don't want to dominate the questions, but I do have some others.
So,
okay.
Go right ahead.
Okay. Do you have like any kind of metrics about what success would look like? I understand like $2.3 billion in development in the next 15 years, but what would short-term success look like for you in 2027?
Well, I would say that I'm going to be very optimistic. I think we will have the $2 billion that MuniCap projected over a 15-year period. I think we'll have that either in the pipeline or, again, going back to Mutual, knowing that they not only have the ground of their campus that they will turn over for development, but they also have land between I-480 and Turner Boulevard. They own a lot of that land. They're not going to sit on it. So I will be optimistic. I think we will have $2 billion in development, either in the pipeline, or on that property that Mutual controls, that we know it will develop. I think we'll have that by 2027. That's my personal opinion. I think also a measurement. Again, Mutual building half the parking they need. This developer that we just talked to the other day, again, building far less parking than they typically would build. I think those are also measurements that we're looking at, because at the end of the day, we're looking at the ability to have essentially billions of dollars worth of development that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise, because so much land would be devoted to parking. And so those are the kinds of measurements we're most focused on. I mean, obviously ridership is important, no question about it, but really at the bottom, at the end of the day, the bottom line is we think we can attract 30,000 jobs and 30,000 residents to the core, but we know they can't fit in the urban core unless we change what we've been doing historically with parking. And so that's development and parking are the two measurements I'm going to look at.
Okay, great. And I just have to play devil's advocate here again, because the TIF money is money that's not going to schools. I mean. Well,
but it's also money that wouldn't happen, so I think, again, I could go back to the slide, but there are two things about that. Number one, if a block is covered with parking and there are no buildings on that block, then you're just going to get the limited amount of revenue that you're getting from parking, and you're not going to get anything else. But if now that block can be developed, and like I said, we think we would average about $50 million in development on a block, that's $50 million that you wouldn't have. And
Yep.
so that's tax revenue that no one would get because it would not be possible to put it on that block. And then on top of that, the second aspect of this is that the streetcar across the country increases property values in other cities. The increases have been anywhere from 7% to 28%. And that's for not just new development, but for existing property. So if you don't have the streetcar, you don't get this additional 7 to 28% bump in value. That's a value and an increase in tax revenue that, again, wouldn't happen because the streetcar is what is making that bump happen. So all of this tax revenue that we're talking about, that we're using for the streetcar, or that we would also use for building affordable housing and bikeways and so forth,
Exactly.
none of that would have happened without the streetcar.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, and Cindy, I'll help you out here. I know Kenneth was helping lead as well. So Lilia has a question. I see a couple from Lilia here. So are there any plans to extend either or both transportation lines out west beyond West Roads?
Sure. And then I see also there's a question about Heartland 2050.
Oh,
So
yes.
as far as the streetcar is concerned, the streetcar really is not designed to go all the way to the West Roads. If there was ever a rail line that went that far west, it would be light rail. And similar to Orbit, it would not stop very often. In fact, light rail probably stops only about once a mile. Whereas Orbit stops, like I said, about every half mile, and then the streetcar stops about every quarter mile. So the light rail line that there have been studies on this, I will say, too, over the last 20 years. It is very difficult to extend light rail west in Omaha. However, there is one corridor where light rail makes some sense, and that is along the west center corridor, and where there's a lot of right of way. So once you get past Exarban Village, so getting to Exarban Village is one thing from downtown, but there are routes that would get there. But from Exarban Village west, there's a lot of right of way. And so a light rail line could work eventually on West Center. And then the other thing that goes with that is that there is a commercial cluster or concentration at every 1 mile intersection along West Center Road. And so you could see a light rail line maybe eventually that could run that line, could run that route. And then you would see increased development around each of those 1 mile nodes. That is the one route that would remove the projected increase in traffic on the interstate. And the cost of widening the interstate is in the $1 billion range. And so, now you start to maybe get to something where it makes some sense to do light rail. The other thing too is that there's also commuter rail. So you could, have commuter rail that would come in from, say, Lincoln, and then come into downtown Omaha. But then once you get into downtown Omaha, you need something like the streetcar to move around downtown. So you get off the commuter rail, get on the streetcar. So that's kind of in terms of the big extensions. However, there are shorter extensions that make some sense. And so an extension into North Omaha makes sense. An extension into South Omaha makes sense. And then Council Bluffs just today asked for support from the Streetcar Authority to look at extending the streetcar over into Council Bluffs. They would like to take it all the way eventually into where the hospitals are located in Council Bluffs, which from downtown to there is sort of like going to Exarban Village. So kind of a similar distance. So short extensions for streetcar, yes. Long extensions, no.
Any chance of getting it to the airport?
Well, I think an extension to the airport makes some sense. Again, when you look at something like that in other cities, they really mostly connect into the downtown area where you have hotels. I mean, that's kind of the primary connection for any kind of a rail connection to an airport. Now, in some cities, it'll extend on from there. Or in the case of Denver, you get from the airport all the way, that's a great distance. So, but yes, I think you could see it extend to the airport. Certainly the state senator would like it to go to North Omaha and then wrap
Yeah.
around the north side of Carter Lake to go to the airport. So
Yeah.
we'll see if that happens, or a more direct route would be something to look at as well. So certainly possible.
Okay, so our questions from Lilia. Yeah, how is this project coordinated and or impacted by Heartland 2050 project? And what is the projected ridership?
So the Heartland 2050 project really led the charge for this regional transit authority that Metro has now created. And so the whole idea of the streetcar is to really provide a service that is sort of coordinated with Metro. So there are like 13 different stops, I think, that or 13 different bus routes that intersect with the streetcar. We've already talked about how it connects to Orbit. So really, I guess my view of this is there are some complications for Metro to actually operate the streetcar. It gets into their federal funding and how that works. And so that's part of the reason why there is a separate authority to do this initial line. I would say, though, as time goes on, if additional lines are built, or certainly if we get to the light rail kind of a situation where you're bringing people in from longer distances, you're really looking then at a merger, I would say, between the streetcar and Metro services. And at that point, it really becomes this multimodal system that becomes more of a regional system. And so it absolutely works together with them. In terms of ridership, we have some ridership projections that were done a number of years ago. The model that was used doesn't work very well for streetcars. There's a different model that can be used called the stops model. Just to kind of give an explanation, the difficulty of projecting ridership on a streetcar. Ridership models for transit look at mostly home to work kinds of trips. They also look a little bit at home to grocery store, services, that kind of thing, but they're primarily designed for home to work. The second problem with ridership models when it comes to streetcars is that in order for the models to work with any accuracy, they have to cross over, and I can never remember the term, but it's like transit zone or something. And so there are the transit zones. If you don't cross over from one zone to the next, it doesn't count the trip. And so the difficulty for a streetcar is that it maybe crosses a couple transit zones is all. And so you really don't get much of a measurement of this sort of travel that occurs on the streetcar. The other thing is that what we're looking at is how much additional new development will happen over time. And mostly the models measure what's happening today. So where we expect to see 30,000 more residents, 30,000 more jobs, we're only going to be based on this current number, which is much smaller. And so you just don't get much in the way of a good measurement the way it works today. And then this hop on, hop off kind of situation. Years ago, I was in Salt Lake City with people from MAPA looking at just how they handle their regional planning, and we were using their light rail system to move around. And I mentioned to the person who was the transportation planner at the time with MAPA, as we hopped on one stop and went 2 stops on their light rail and got off, I said to him, I said, we just didn't take that trip. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, that trip would not show up on the measurement ridership estimates. And he said, yeah, you're right. That trip doesn't show up on a ridership estimate. So I think we will see a number that is maybe in the 3,000 per day range, someplace in that range when we finally get open and operating. The initial year, again, we're free to ride, so that will increase ridership numbers. And for the first year, we'll probably see a big bump in ridership initially, and then we'll probably see it tail off and then be a little more constant after that, and then slowly grow as we have more development over time.
Thank you. Our next question is from Lynn. Why did the city allow the streetcar and Orbit to have a similar route?
Well, good question. The two things. Dodge Street is the logical spine for the city for cross-city transportation, and then connections to that Dodge Street line. Again, what they're looking at now, that 24th Street line, makes perfect sense. That is a through street all the way from North Omaha to South Omaha. Again, 72nd would be another one, and so forth. So that's kind of the logic behind the Orbit line. The second thing for the streetcar, though, is that it, in a similar way, the places that people want to go in the urban core are along that Farnham Street route. And so from a hop on, hop off kind of an idea, being able to connect the old market to the kind of business core and the core of the government services at City Hall and the courthouse, and then on to Midtown and Blackstone and so forth. They're all along that Farnham Street route. What people probably don't realize is that the very first streetcar in the city ran on Farnham Street. And so it's always been a corridor where there's been a lot of walkability. So it makes sense for a streetcar to run along Farnham Street. The other thing that I think people don't necessarily think about is that, as I mentioned a minute ago, there are a lot of bus routes that do intersect and connect to the streetcar. I think 13 different routes that intersect with the streetcar, and they also intersect with Orbit. So again, different services, but here's another thing to think about. If you tried to use Orbit in the same way as the streetcar for a hop on, hop off type of service, once it got to 42nd Street, let's say, now Orbit doesn't work like Orbit. Now it works like a slower bus. And so it really loses its benefit when it, if you were to stop every, 3 blocks or so when you got east of 42nd Street, you'd have to have more buses. And so Orbit doesn't really function very well that way. So if you want Orbit to be fast, you really can't stop that often. So that's kind of the rationale. We studied a lot of different routes and looked at various options, and this combination made the most sense.
Wow, Cindy, that's so special. Your great grandfather was a streetcar conductor. Wow.
Oh, cool.
Yes,
Cool.
he was.
That is so cool.
Well, great. Yeah, it's interesting when we look at this current route, but future extensions. You really are going back to those old routes. That's
Yeah.
where they go, because they put them where it made sense to begin with. Physically, you can't go over about a 4% grade, so the stops can't be over a 4% grade. The grade can't go much over 5%. So there's a limited number of routes, and then because when the streetcar, what people also don't think about is we're looking at the streetcar from a development standpoint. Well, the streetcar line that ran to Dundee was built by the developer. The one that went to Benson was built by the developer. So they were built by people who wanted to develop property.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
That's very cool.
It will be special when I ride that for the first time. I'll take my mom.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Lynn, I have another question. Do you think Omaha can afford both the streetcar and Orbit? And do you foresee Orbit becoming economically unfeasible?
No, absolutely we can afford both. We will be using the increased revenue that comes from parking to pay for the operation maintenance of the streetcar. So although we will see less new parking being built, we'll see more revenue from the parking that we have and from the parking that's being built. So so the streetcar is really going to pay for itself, at least this phase, using the parking revenue. As far as Orbit is concerned, I think they just reached their 1 millionth rider since they opened, and considering they opened before the pandemic, I mean, that's pretty amazing. So Orbit, I think, has been successful, will continue to be successful, and a critical part of the overall transit system for the city, and critical for the urban core. So Orbit, absolutely, I think, you know, it will be a very successful line. My guess is the most successful line in Metro's system, and I think will be indispensable.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for all the amazing questions. Is there any other questions? I know we've asked a lot already.
No, that's fine. You know, if I could just say one thing, I think the biggest thing, two big things that I think would be very helpful for your folks to be able to help people understand. Number one, I think most people think that their tax dollars go into some pot that is called tax increment, and that when a development happens, the city reaches into that tax increment pot that they put their money into and give it to the developer. And I think, as you heard me say today, but I think you've all probably understood as well, no, the tax increment only happens because that development happens and the increase in taxes that are paid by that developer. That's the tax revenue that we're using. So if there's no development, there's no tax increment. And so the only question is just, you know, how quickly does that bond that is floated by the developer get paid off, and then how quickly does that tax revenue then go on to the taxing entities. So I think that's the biggest thing for people to understand. And then I think that the second thing that I hope is a takeaway from this is that we have looked forever at how do we change this parking trajectory in downtown, because we are asked every time a developer comes in for help in subsidizing parking. And our parking division has done an amazing job. We were subsidizing parking in downtown for property owners, businesses in downtown, to the tune of about $2 million a year up until about 10 years ago, when the parking division was created. They have done an amazing job of really balancing that and beginning to start to make a little bit of money, but they can't do it forever. And so I think that's the second thing, is just that we will not be able to get this development to occur in the urban core if we don't change that parking dynamic. And if buses could do it, then we wouldn't have all the parking that we have, because we've had the best bus service in our urban core any place in the city ever since we switched to buses. So it's nothing against buses. They just don't, if you're a developer and you're going to make an investment, and it's tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, and somebody says, don't worry, this flexible bus is going to run here, you know, would you take the risk? And developers won't, and the bankers won't. They say, no, we better build that parking. And so that's the thing we have to turn around, and that's where the permanency of the tracks makes a difference, because they say, well, if you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to put something permanent in place, we can bet that you're going to be there for the next 30 years while we're paying off our loan. So I think that's the second thing for people to understand, is that if there was a different way to do this that was less expensive, we would do it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Steve, very much for this really good overview and picture and forecast of what's coming. I think we've all learned so much tonight. If there was, I know that you've had open houses, and I think I'm on some emails, or I've subscribed to some emails, but if people wanted to follow the progress of this plan, what should they do? Is there a
Go to
website? Or-
omahastreetcar.org. And there's all kinds of information. Karina, did I get that right?
You did, and I just shared it in the chat as well. So if you want to sign up for a
Fantastic.
newsletter or learn more, definitely keep up with that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Well, if there aren't any more questions, again,
And one other thing,
Yeah.
if anybody has a group that wants to hear about this, the mayor
okay.
tells me to make sure everybody understands. She'll come talk to anybody, and so just let us know.
Fantastic. Well, we obviously, like, we recorded this and we'll put it on our website. We will spread the word. Don't be surprised if you hear from us again. This has been a great presentation, and we appreciate you, Karina, coming tonight and kind of facilitating this whole thing too. So you're always so helpful and knowledgeable about everything. So we appreciate it. We appreciate you guys in the audience and asking the questions. But yeah, we would look forward to hearing more about this and writing soon.
Great.
So, okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
One.
Bye
All right,
all.
everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.